want clarification on during our discussion, use the Q&A to queue up questions that you want us to ask the panelists either towards the end of this live broadcast or during the private Q&A at the end. Depending on time, I may work some of those into the main broadcast. And for those of you watching on YouTube Live, again, it's a 1-hour broadcast, which will be for you and for anyone who's watching this even on the replay later. And then the last 30 minutes after the live hour, we'll have a private Q&A with just the companies that are part of the MedTech Innovator cohort. There's 62 companies in our US program, so a lot of them are here today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists for today. The topic for today's discussion is really clinical studies and really talking about the different things that come up involved in clinical trial planning and execution, both pre-approval all the way through to post-market. And we've got some terrific experts that are here to talk about this today. I'm going to introduce each of them now, and then we'll get into the discussion. So first of all, I'm going to introduce our Proxima CRO team. Proxima is one of the partners here at MedTech Innovator that we've been very lucky to work with over the last few years. And we're lucky to be joined today by Kevin Coker and Matt Wagner. So we'll start off with you, Kevin, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I'm Kevin Coker. I'm the CEO of Proxima Clinical Research, otherwise known as Proxima CRO. Paul, congratulations on, just saw you guys were recognized as being the largest med tech or med device accelerator on the planet. Congrats on that. And we were really happy to be working with MedTech Innovator. We have a CRO based in Houston, Texas, but we work with folks all over the United States and outside. We've worked with MedTech Innovator for the last couple of years, and we support emerging medical device clients.
Terrific. Thanks, Kevin. And thank you for recognizing that. We were extremely proud of that recognition. I think we suspected for a long time that we were the largest medical device accelerator, but until we saw the data from Silicon Valley Bank, that was the first time we actually saw it.
And by a lot. I mean, a lot.
yeah, by a lot. And wait till the Q3 report when we include this year's cohort. So that doesn't include any of the companies we have this year. So the numbers we're gonna be off the charts. All right, but thank you for that, Kevin. Next up, Matt Wagner, also from Proxima, VP Clinical Operations. Matt?
Yep. Thanks, guys, for having us today. Again, looking forward to the discussion. So, as you said, I'm VP of Clinical Operations with Proxima. So I work alongside Kevin and our team, and I focus primarily on helping companies plan and execute in the clinical space. So looking forward to the discussion. Have a background, number of years in the CRO space, running and executing clinical trials and helping grow CRO businesses. And then prior to that, spent early years in academia. So been at the site level side as well earlier in my career. So excited to see technologies come out of the lab and into the clinic over the number of years.
Excellent. Thanks, Matt. We're glad to have you here. Okay, next up, Dr. Frank Peacock, he's professor and vice chair of research at the Baylor College of Medicine. Tell us about yourself, Frank. And you're on mute right now, Frank, sorry. I can unmute you, I think maybe for here. Let me see if I can do it. You may have to do like *6 or something on your phone, I think. Let's see if I can do it for you. No, it just says ask to unmute. I think it's *6 when you're dialed in. There you go. You're good.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Excellent. So I'm an emergency doctor. That's how I trained. That was about 30 years ago. I do a lot of cardiology stuff. So I'm also a fellow American College of Cardiology. So that's sort of my niche. I wear a lot of hats. You said I'm the vice chair for research, emergency medicine research at Baylor. I also have a small specialty CRO that I run. I run an education company, and I am the chief medical officer for a company called Aseptoscope. So my days are parted into little pieces.
I like it, like many of us, right? Okay, well, thanks, guys. So great group of experts here to talk about the topic. So great to have you here. So first question I want to ask is, because we have a cohort of companies that are here with us today that are small companies. They might be super early stage, and they might be, as I said, all the way up to companies that are on the market, but they're all small companies. So the first question is, do you routinely work with small companies? And if so, how do you find them? Do they find you? Do you seek them out? And then also maybe you can comment on what it's like working with a small company versus working with a large company. So I'll start with the Proxima team, Kevin.
Yeah, I love taking the softball questions. We almost, I wouldn't say exclusively, but about 85% of our business is emerging companies. You put startups in there. We work with folks all the way from virtual teams to people that are really just still trying to put their PowerPoint deck together. We work with the biodesign groups out of Stanford and the Texas Medical Center, where we're headquartered. And so we're very used to working with small companies, which is, really, it's a very different mindset than working with larger companies. All of our founders have come from, small companies, have owned small companies, and really understand, the pressure and the way that they think. And the way that people usually find us, other than the website and some of the things that we do, like through MedTech Innovator, we're really happy to partner with you all for the second year. We have some offices in J Labs and then the Texas Medical Center, but it's really referrals. Referrals are our number one source. And so we work with one company and we work hard to earn their business. And then we're referred by another company. In fact, just this last month, we had 9 contracts that we signed, and 8 of them were all off referrals of other companies, 2 of them from MedTech Innovator companies.
Great. Glad to hear that. So Frank, same question to you. How often are you working with small companies and, both maybe both on the PI side as well as on the CRO side?
So on the PI side, I end up working with everybody because big companies have big projects they need to get done, and so that's easy. The CRO side, it's much more likely to be small because big companies tend to have that internally, and they have the difference between other big companies and little companies is big companies have a lot more lawyers. It makes them very slow and difficult, to be quite honest, to work with. They have regulatory on top of regulatory. And that's because they are targets frequently, and so they have to do that. But they are not nimble by any stretch. How you get out there and get known is Kevin talked a lot about it. There's a lot of networking going on. I have a network of about 80 emergency departments across the U.S. that I've done research with over the years, and so when I'm needing to get centers, I just call some of them. And when they have projects that they're expanding, they'll call me too. So there's that interpersonal business that goes on, as well as every time you publish a paper, your name is on it, and it goes out there into the ether. I've got over 600 publications. So when companies have some niche they're looking for, and I publish them before, they'll find me. And so that's another way to do it is, and that's an important trick for the company, actually, is that finding KOLs is a nightmare. First off, every doctor will tell you that they're great and will do it, and they're right out flat lying to you. They look at that as this is an opportunity to make some money. And so they're not really lying, but they're more than happy to exaggerate because they want your business too. They want you to come do research with them. So figuring out who is a proper target is sometimes challenging. And one of the ways to do that is you just do a PubMed search and find out who are the big people. That serves 2 purposes. When you're done, if you don't get published, you've wasted a lot of money and time. And so it's really important to do that. And while everybody will say they can publish, the reality is the number of people who can publish is less than 5%. So you need to have those folks on board as part of your KOL team. So that's, a really good way to find people is just the literature that exists.
That's a really good point, Frank. And something I was going to bring up later in the discussion, but since you opened that door, let me ask, dig into that just a little bit more, which is, people want to be associated perhaps with a particular product, and they may not be able to enroll in the way that they claim to, or something of that related to that. So is it just based on seeing the literature? I mean, how else can you tell that someone can really deliver on what they're promising to?
Yeah, so there are a couple tricks there. First off, that the PI never actually does the enrolling. there's always a research tech or nurse or somebody who's touching the patient and interacting. And that's who is going to tell you the truth. If you tell the PI, they say, yeah, we'll run 5 a day and we'll do 25 a week, and no problem, I'll have the study done in a month. And the nurse will look at you and go, are you out of your mind? We're going to enroll 2 a week. And that's the truth. Believe the nurse. They're the ones doing the work. They know the challenges of whatever your inclusion, exclusion criteria are, and the IRB and all that stuff, and they will have it on, and they'll tell you the truth. So when the nurse tells you 2 a week, then that means you're going to need 30 centers, not 5.
Good, very good point. Talk to the nurse, talk to the person who really knows the data. So that's a really good tip. I saw a comment just come into the chat from one of our companies asking, how do you evaluate a CRO? Don't CROs potentially overinflate their ability to deliver? So Kevin, I'm going to put that one back to you.
Yes, they do. CROs are service companies, and they exist to make money. But I think whether you're looking to get your KOLs or your CRO in place, the biggest thing is interviewing them like you would an employee, like a member of your team. Trust is a really hard thing to get through a resume and also from a website. And so I would actually encourage as people evaluate CROs, evaluate their KOLs, any type of partnerships, that they go through a process, not only just asking for an RFP or and getting understanding what the costs are, and then negotiating those costs, or understanding if they've done something in this particular space, but really going through the type of evaluation that you would to understand the trust that you have in this particular group, of people. So yes, CROs certainly, they are always sometimes, working the business development side of things, and we're trying to earn business just like other CROs. But I think really trying to evaluate them, understanding how they'll work with us very specifically, especially as an emerging company. If you're an emerging company, what's that strategy going to be? And using the same methods that you would for an employee, use it to evaluate CROs and other types of service providers.
Yeah, no, that's good advice, Kevin. And frankly, I think references are certainly going to be a big part of all that, right? Talk to people who've worked with you before. All right, so let's get back to the agenda here. Oh, sorry, please. Yeah, Frank, please go ahead.
Yeah, so there's 2 things about the CROs. First off, past performance is no predictor of future returns like the stock market, but it's the best thing we got. If you got a CRO that is really good in space, they'll be good in the space. And if you're asking them to do airplane landing gear and they've never done that before, you're going to kill a bunch of people. So make sure that they've done what they can do. The other thing is your contract. When you write a CRO contract, if you put a bunch of stupid stuff in there, you're going to get eaten alive. What you need to write down on there is that's going to be termed to enrollment. I don't care how many centers you have or how many famous people sign this thing, because that doesn't matter. At the end of the day, your study doesn't end until you've enrolled however many people you need to enroll. So that's what the number should be in your contract. We pay you for enrollments. All that other crap you do, that's on you. That's your inefficiencies. You eat it. Sorry, you're the CRO. Get it together. And if they can't do that, then you need a different CRO.
And to that point then, Frank, so, I know one of the things that's really important is, the time to, enrolling a first patient. And is that something like, is it common to have something in the agreement to say, that you terminate the agreement if they don't do it by a certain time?
So I don't think that's so important, quite honestly. What I think is most important is the time to enroll the last patient. And that's the one that matters, because the starting of the first patient, the centers that you pick will be critical. There are some centers that are real fast out of the box. They'll enroll a patient, and then they enroll 1 a month thereafter, and that's killing you. There's centers that are really slow because they're big behemoths, and I'll give you examples. Everybody wants the Cleveland Clinic, the Mayo Clinic, and Harvard on their trial. Those are the 3 slowest, worst centers on the globe. And they think, well, we'll have them, then we'll get credibility because we got fancy guys. You want 1 fancy guy. You don't need more than 1. They are the slowest, most regulatory impeded bodies there are. I was at Cleveland Clinic for 17 years. I know how slow they are, but you do want one on there, because there is the truth of there is some publicity factor that you get from having the big guy, but you don't need lots of big guys. What you really need are lots of little people who can crank up the numbers for you, because you have, at the end of the day, it's enrollments, and that's what you got to get. So you get your one, Mass General on board, and then everybody else is Oklahoma and Kansas City and Indianapolis and places that don't have big names, but they enroll like crazy.
Good advice. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about some of the issues. Let's talk about some things that go well. So maybe we could start off by Kevin. What's an example of a study that you've been involved with that you're super proud of, and why?
One that comes to mind is one that we've done recently. It was actually with a medtech innovator company. I believe they went through your class maybe 2 years ago, Seronis. They have a device that was it was granted through a de novo application to the FDA. We actually did their study before they their clinical utility study or clinical marketing study before they started selling the device. That one was a great one because it was a company that we, or at least that I knew before we actually even formed Proxima 2 years ago. And so we knew that company. We met them through MedTech Innovator. We were almost personally invested in their success. When the time came for us to work on the clinical stuff, we were so excited to be a part of that. It was actually the very first study that we did as a company, not all of us as individuals, but as a company. And we had a great strategy with the CEO's offer. We understood, sort of like Frank was saying, we understood where our cornerstone site was going to be. We figured out what the other high enrolling sites were going to be. We had an excellent kickoff. The thing enrolled much faster than what we had even expected. We had great contingency plans in place, and we finished way ahead of schedule. And we were all really happy with the results of that. And then that enabled their sales team to then go and sell the product. So that's one I'm really particularly happy with, just from a personal and a professional standpoint.
It's great, and good explanation as to why. Frank, you want to tell us about an example of something you're real proud of? I'm sure you got lots.
Sure. That's happened just recently. I had a very large diagnostic company come to me, and it's COVID world now, right? And they said, we have this trial and we needed to get it going up quickly. And historically, the thing that everybody wanted to hurry up was that you had your burn rate, and it's eating your venture capital, and you're going to go out of business. So you had to hurry because you're running out of money. In COVID, it's a different world. It's no longer hurry because you're running out of money. It's hurry because people are dying. And so we want this done now. And they hand me the protocol, and that's when the clock starts. It's not when you start talking about your protocol or getting your key opinion leaders to get it. It's when the protocol is done and ready. So they hand me the protocol, and so we built a 20-center trial across the U.S. and had first patient enrolled in 22 days, which for blowing out a study, normally that takes 4 to 6 months. And we completely disrupted the industry by changing the mechanism of how we pay and how we contract. We told the sites that we were not going to negotiate contracts. If they said that, the he, she should be they, and they cross that out and it goes back and forth between the lawyers, that's ridiculous. We said, if there's a major liability problems, we'll address that. But if there's nothing major, we're not doing little tiny adjustments. And the sites all agreed, because it's not really an unreasonable request. We then structured a budget that we thought was fair and robust, and we told the sites we would not negotiate that. This is the budget, and if you don't like it, that's unfortunate, but there are lots of sites, and we'll move on. And 50% of the sites did not participate, but that still left us with more than 20 sites. And by taking those two things out, the negotiating over the budget and the negotiating, and because when you get these budget negotiations, they negotiate, well, we're going to charge you for teleconferences, we're going to charge you for copies, we're going to charge you for storage, there's some dry ice charges, and it's just absurd. It's like, you tell me, we'll just give you enough money, you cover it, divide it up however you need to do it, but don't harass us about that. And they all agreed. And that's how we started a study in 3 weeks of protocol closure.
Wow. So yeah, it's really interesting, Frank. And you mentioned we're in COVID world, so let's talk about that a little bit then. So what are some of the ways in which COVID is affecting clinical studies now? I don't care so much about what's happened behind us. What's happening right now? What are the changes? What are the impact, whether it's on enrollment, with general delays, changing in-person visits, I'm sure, to virtual visits in many cases. Protocol changes. What's COVID doing to the clinical trial business, both in the process, both here in the U.S. and maybe we'll talk about OUS as well separately. Well, let's start with the U.S. So who wants to take that first?
I'll take it first.
I'll do that. Oh, yeah, go ahead. You haven't talked yet. Go ahead.
Sure, I'll jump in here. So yeah, I mean, it's a different time with COVID, and I think it's slightly exciting, I guess, in terms of people being innovative. So I think that's really the difference that I see. A lot of companies that we work with are trying to think outside the box to make sure their study doesn't have the same hurdles that other companies are having. And, I mean, first off, it's virtual visits. I think, as you mentioned, Paul, and we're starting to see really what needs to be done in person and what doesn't need to be done in person. And we've had a virtual startup of a couple of our trials here recently in the past couple of months. So as long as those sites are willing to open to new research, that's kind of their first question that we're seeing a lot of sites ask themselves when it comes to COVID world. But then once they answer that question for themselves, uniquely for the hospital or clinic, then we get into the how, and that's where it starts to move into virtual visits, virtual training, virtual qualification. The biggest hurdle I've seen has been with larger device product on one of our studies, where you really need some hands-on training of that actual device and coordinating with the clinic, how are they handling now the logistics of getting that product into their facility. But the rest of it's starting to actually become a little more efficient, efficient training of the protocol and efficient collection of documents, efficient contracting and moving, because they're actually excited to do research again. Their IRBs that had stopped are now, picking back up as well. And so that seems to be starting to move along a little bit more efficiently these days. So definitely, I like the virtual aspect that we're starting to see, and I don't see that changing as we move forward.
Good, thank you for that. And Frank, I know you've got some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, about 2 years ago, I started restructuring my whole operations to be completely virtual, and people literally called me stupid. And they said, why are you wasting money on that? And I said, well, because someday this is going to be more efficient than doing what you're doing. And so when COVID hit, we were completely in the box, ready to roll, and we did. The advantage of that is in old budgets, we had a $50,000 for an investigator meeting. We did it on Zoom, 100 people, just like we're doing today. I can never charge again for $50,000 investigator meeting because it just isn't necessary. And like Matt said, if you have some crazy big device that you need to have a meeting, you can have a meeting still, but most of those have gone away. The entire consent process now is done virtually. You don't need to have, and you don't want to have somebody in there with a piece of paper and then come out of the room and it's got COVID on it. You want to take that home? It's like, no, I do not want to take that home. Throw that away right now. And so we've gone complete, and the FDA is completely behind on this. A lot of the big companies go, oh, no, we can't do that. It's like, no, the FDA is actually helping. And that doesn't always happen. But in this case, they say they'll accept verbal, iPad, or phone pictures of a signed consent form. So everything is now in the cloud, as it should be. Same thing with electronic case report forms. I don't see the point of paper anymore. I've not liked paper for quite some time, and I really don't see the point of it anymore. And then when you're done, it all goes in a master trial file, and you give the FDA a URL and a password and say, here it is. And the world has been improved, and I can't imagine we're ever going back on that. Studies that were non-COVID in the height of COVID were really tough to do because you have to have the risk of the nurse going to see this patient, and you have to weigh, this is a vitamin trial. Is it really worth this nurse getting exposed to COVID? I don't want to do that. So now so that's an issue. So you have to decide where is the benefit. Now that COVID seems to be, it's not going to go away. People are saying, oh, maybe we do got to do vitamin trials again. So, okay, we're going to do them. Now there's the PPE expense. So you just have to make your peace with that. PPE is not going away. I'm not going to see a patient who might have COVID without the full gear on. We know the full gear works. I'm going to wear it. You don't have it, I'm not doing your trial. So you got to make your peace with that, figure out how to work it out. We do have supply chain issues. N95 masks are hard to get. You're going to have them. You can either have the hospital supply them and cost you, or you supply them, but you got to figure out how to get around that and all those issues associated with that trial. But efficiency has gotten way better. I like Matt's perspective. This is the way it's going to be, and I don't see any way we could go backwards on it. So it's here to stay.
So, and those are all, those benefits that you're talking about, I think are particularly exciting. I've been part of those, in the past, Frank, or at least observed some of those investigator meetings and things where you, as you said, you fly people in from all over the place and you spend all this money and people are half asleep anyways or whatever. I mean, it's just like, I don't know, it's just not a huge productive use of people's time. At least on Zoom, we can see everyone's face and we can see what they're doing, and we don't have to spend any money on it. Other than the cost of having Zoom. So, I think those kinds of changes are terrific. And the virtual visits, are really interesting. What are cases when you can't do a virtual visit? Are there any in particular when, something has to still be in person? Matt?
Yeah, I mean,
Frank? Either one.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I think you have to weigh that out a little bit on a case by case, depending on what you have to get done. I kind of agree with Frank too. There's a lot of sites though out there that can do more than you think. Don't look at just the KOL or just that site that you feel like you have to have their name on the paper. Evaluate a lot broader than that, and I think you'll be able to start to see sites that will start to have those flexibilities. We've seen that with a couple of studies with larger centers. Again, there's always the time delay, contracting and stuff like that. But now we're getting into, questions of, can I review the source documents? And so if they can give you access to the EMR to actually review that source, which a lot of sites I see are pushing that forward within their clinics. Prior to COVID, sites kind of only did if they had to, and so then you're kind of a little bit stuck there. If you've got a site that you had to have put on that study, you needed them on the study, you've got to fly a CRA out there and review the source documents in person and do it kind of the old fashioned way. And they may have even have an electronic medical record. They just didn't want to go through the administrative burden of kind of pushing that forward into giving remote access to anyone, outside the institution. They just don't want to answer that question for them administratively. Whereas now we're starting to see sites say, oh, no, I don't want anyone physically touching, coming on campus. And so they're making it happen. So I see that again as another good thing. There still may be a few instances where we have, sites that are going to lag behind, or, you feel like you need them because they're a really good enroller, and you still want to do your due diligence and make sure the CRA has a chance to, monitor the source documents that are needed. But I think we're even starting to see that tweak a little bit. We're getting into that targeted monitoring, risk-based monitoring, however you want to call that as well, and say, okay, what source do I really need to view so I can make this very efficient? Can I do that via, even a Zoom type of call? And we're seeing that happen with a couple of sites that haven't quite pushed the remote EMR access. They're pushing it into like a virtual meeting like this on Zoom. So we're starting to see a lot of sites, pick up and start to push that forward. There might still be an instance where you really need to go out and verify at least something, if they really can't give you any virtual access and you really feel like there's a need to have them on your study.
Okay. That's great. Thank you very much for that. And one of the questions that also was asked by one of our companies is for non-COVID related studies. So companies that are, whether it could be orthopedics, whatever it might be, are clinical studies happening? Is enrollment happening in those studies? Is that ramping back up, or is everything on pause? Whoever wants to take that.
Yeah, I'll start it, and then I appreciate Frank's perspective. But every hospital is different. So you've obviously every jurisdiction, every state is different. We're certainly now seeing things open back up. Interestingly enough, as cases are on the rise here in Houston, things that have been on hold for us at local hospitals like MD Anderson and Baylor and others are now open. We just reopened a study at Baylor like 2 days ago, got patients back and enrolling. So it is happening. I think the question is, to what extent which studies are not part of the opening. You know, a lot of hospitals and IRBs have put in place things that are elective procedures are still not going to happen. We had a study the other day, and we were trying to figure out, it was a study that involved a breast cancer biopsy. And we were like, why is this study not reopening? And our team came back and said, well, it's an elective procedure. And I was like, the biopsies are an elective procedure? Well, yes, they were. So we're having to understand what's happening at each individual hospital and each individual state, but things are certainly opening back up. To what extent that continues to happen, I don't know, but there seems to be a commitment of everything unthawing overall.
Great. So one of the things that I think I kind of want to get into then is, you know, advances in general. So we've been talking about some of the improvements that COVID has brought about or accelerated, certainly. What about other things that are happening, perhaps that are, you know, changes in clinical studies that our companies need to be aware of that, you know, that will make their, you know, make it easier for them, make it more efficient? Are there any particular developments or advances in the field that our companies should be aware of? Frank.
I think there's a lot less tendency to have the regulatory cloak that was such a negative headwind before, because everybody has these ideas that you can't do this or that because they're rules. And I think what I've seen, that there's been a lot of more willingness to say, well, that's a dumb rule. It's not building efficiencies, and so we're going to be okay if we don't do that. And Matt talked about the site visits. It's like, everybody used to think you had to have a site visit. Well, no, that's $3,000 to send a CRA there. We don't have to do that anymore. If we can accomplish the same objective, then that's something that we can do. So I think that's across the board, and the site visit is a good example. But there's a lot of things that we always did because that's the way we always did them. I'm not even sure that we still have to be looking at source documents. As we've moved to the electronic case report form, some of the stuff is directly piped into the form. Do I need a source document for that? Well, probably not. The consent forms, those are an example of a different way of doing business. We actually destroy the consent form if it's been signed. So after taking a picture. So I think there's a lot of that which has improved our efficiencies.
Great. Thank you for that. One last question maybe on that topic is related to, you know, just enrolling and finding patients in the first place. There's a bunch of companies that have sprung up that, you know, are doing a lot of mobile-based recruitment and Facebook recruitment, whatever it might be, I don't know, but using AI to, you know, to find patients. Are there any, you know, are you guys working with any of those kinds of vendors? You know, do you see those things happening anytime soon? Whoever wants it. Kevin, you want to go?
Yes, we've certainly been working with a couple of, you know, talking with companies outside of Proxima to help us execute on like the entire virtual trial space, particularly in post-marketing situations. There's a couple of companies I'll just drop that you know we've talked to. Halo is one that we've talked to, and they've got sort of a virtual trial environment. There's a few others out there. Also, too, there's groups like that have you know, that help with connected medical devices and help extract data, like Galen Data. That's a great group. We've worked on a couple of collaborative projects. We were able to extract data from this connected medical device environment. That's an opportunity, something that is, I think, very exciting in where we are moving forward in this post-COVID world. And then I'll just maybe back up and answer, you know, reinforce a different question. But, you know, when you're talking to a CRO and you're trying to get everything out of them and maximize your dollar and maximize your strategy, going back to, I can't remember if it was Matt or Frank, but using a risk-based monitoring approach, that sounds like a really fancy word. But what that what that does is monitoring is one of the biggest costs in clinical trials. And so really appreciating exactly how much data needs to be monitored, how many patients, what's the, per patient monitoring sufficiency that you have to do. Those are some of the biggest cost drivers. So maybe it's not the most exciting technology, but it's definitely something that I hope people walk away from and think, okay, I've got to, when I talk to CROs or talk to other consultants, I really need to understand the data monitoring component of this study and what are you bringing that's unique to it? What are you bringing that's strategic to it? And how is that going to help me have high quality data and be more efficient?
Thanks, Kevin.
Paul, I'll add a little bit to those two things on the tech piece too, because I wanted to add to what Frank said too. We've seen several companies push forward e-consent, and that again, that helps the paperwork, but it also helps on the monitoring side, because again, if they didn't have a process in place, now you have one. It's instantly, easily to verify that consent, which is again just a basic oversight element, but it's something that can be done real quickly when you have an e-consent process, put in place. So there's a couple of vendors out there doing that. And, we work with a company called Medrio, and they have that technology for e-consent. And then there's also a couple of providers of EDC that are actually linking to the EMR. That's probably one of the most exciting things that I see is actually pulling data from the EMR into the EDC. And there's a couple of different EDC providers that are starting to do that now. And so I'm actually hopeful that that's one of the, waves that'll come forward here in the next, 6 months or so, that'll just be pushing that forward, because that's, again, it cuts down on monitoring time, it cuts down on data entry time, data capture. So it's just one of those efficiency things. The data out there, even the source, is electronic now. So why do we need to push it and capture it in two places? So it's one of those kind of obvious things, but now there's a couple of vendors that are actually making that happen. So I love to see that come forward.
Yeah, no, I think
I wanted to add one thing to Kevin, which was the finding of patients, and you talked about AI. There's the other thing so there's two things. You either have an event and go to the hospital. So the ER is really good at that. You don't get in the hospital anymore without going through the ER. So that's a good filter. But the other is the people who have chronic diseases. And what I found is very useful is that, once again, all the good stuff in the internet, if you've got somebody with primary pulmonary hypertension, an orphan disease, difficult to find those patients, they don't have very many events. And when they do have them, you don't recognize it as the cause. But there are patient support groups out there, and you can tap into those. And those people are like just vehement about fixing this. And so you have all sorts of people on your team in about 30 seconds who are now working for you to gather patients. And so that's been very helpful for us when we're doing odd, not very obvious presentations. So.
Good stuff. Thanks, Frank. So common mistakes. Let's talk about that a little bit. I'm going to give this one to you, Kevin. So what are some common mistakes made by early stage companies, small companies in general? What advice can you offer to avoid those mistakes? We don't want people making mistakes that they can avoid.
So, I think a couple of the top ones one is confirmation bias. Whether that's, with your company, raising money, developing your product, developing your study, interpreting your data. You are hardwired from the beginning to absolutely believe and to think that your product is differentiating and that it's doing what it's supposed to do. And getting out of that confirmation bias is really tough, especially when you're at the clinical state or clinical phase of development. We see companies that have data locks that come back and they're getting data and they're not interpreting the data appropriately. They're not questioning the data appropriately. They're using certain parts. So I think, not being illegal or unethical, but I think getting out of that confirmation bias mentality is one of the mistakes that emerging companies and probably every company, but emerging companies make. And you really need to bring in different perspectives in the clinical phase. And then I would think, probably going back to Frank's earlier point, making sure that your clinical study is answering as many questions as you can answer, particularly the reimbursement and market access questions, and questions that you may just really need to get from your users, like, does my device work the way that you would want it to work? Is there a different way, a different way you'd like to get this data? Was there a feature set or something? You need to ask those questions to the people using your device. And there's certainly clinical endpoints that you want to capture, but your clinical study is an opportunity to ask all those questions that you want to do or need to do. And so I would say those two things are the top two in my list, Paul.
Thanks, Kevin. And Frank, you maybe want to share some thoughts on that as well, too. What are some of the things that, both common mistakes, but also opportunities that people have that they blow, that they miss because, they just didn't think it through?
Yeah, so we don't have 2 days, so I'll have to shorten it up. But, the way that works is your KOLs have a tremendous amount of influence. And you need to pick the right KOLs. Just because they're a big guy at some big hospital doesn't mean crap when it comes to publishing. And I'll tell you right now, if they haven't published in 5 years, they're not going to publish in 5 more. And you better have a long-term vision, because if you can't get published, you're going to die. I'm great. You got FDA clearance. You can't publish, you're going to die. So the FDA clearance is not the end of the game. And so if you don't have the long-term vision of what do I do the first 2 years after FDA clearance, you're killing yourself. So the way to solve this problem is you get your KOLs together. You want KOLs published in the field that you're in. And the reason you want to get them together before you start your trial is to ask them the questions that they would want to have publications on downstream. So they'll come up with one question. You put one line in your case report form, and that question's answered. And now you have a publication 2 days after you get FDA clearance that says, doctors love this when you do that. Well, that's a great publication. That sells your device for you. Without it, you're out there knocking on doors, and it's really hard. So it's important to get your KOLs in really early and have them tell you what they need downstream, so that that one question is in there. Because without that one question, you just did an $8 million trial, and you don't get a publication on market impact, or how much physicians like it, or does it make the nurse's job easier, or all those things that become really important downstream. There's one other thing that I want to make sure on the error issue is you do a study, there's 3 criteria and you can pick 2. It's good, cheap, or fast. All the time, everybody wants it cheap and good. That means it's not fast. And failing to do a study quickly means your burn rate kills you and you go out of business. So your study has to be done quickly. And nobody has endless money. So how do you get that done? Well, one of the ways that companies always think is, we'll just do 2 centers and they'll enroll a lot and we'll get done. It's like, are you kidding me? 2 centers won't get anything done quickly. If you look at cost drivers for your trial, the number one is always the number of patients. If you need 1,000 patients, that's your cost driver right there, 1,000 patients. And if you've got to enroll 1,000 patients and you're going to go cheap on the number of centers, let's say you have 10 centers and they enroll 10 a week and it's going to take 10 weeks to get done, that's not how it works. And what will happen is they will actually enroll 5 a week. And so you've doubled that. The way you get around that is add centers. You always need twice as many centers as you thought you did. And that's the reason is because when you start a study of every 10 centers you have, and I do this all the time, I get my best 10 centers from the last trial, we start the new trial. And 2 of them blow it out of the water and they enroll patients left and right, and 2 of them stink. They enrolled 1 patient. And you go to them and say, what happened? Why you were so good last month? Why are you so bad now? And they go, well, my research nurse died. And you go, oh, God, I'm sorry. And that happens in real life. 20% will do really good and 20% will do really bad. And 60% that are left in the middle will just be average. So if you haven't planned for that, you've now added 3 months to your trial and you're looking at your burn rate over your shoulder. So add more centers than you think you need. It's not a big cost up front and it will save you later. And the other thing is make sure your KOLs can publish and you figured it out ahead of time. Okay.
Thank you, Frank. So let's in the time we have left, I'm gonna skip ahead to some things that I was gonna cover later, which are for some of the companies we have who are from Europe, and they want to know a lot of things related to doing studies in Europe and how that might impact their U.S. work. So one question is, to what extent can data that has been driven from Europe be used in your FDA approval and clearance without having to redo that study in the US? Kevin.
Yeah, it's a really big question. And if there's anyone that, wants to talk about that specifically, they can certainly reach out to us. My email is kevin@proximacro.com. I'll post it in the chat here so folks can have it. But, for the most part, you have to look at the medical practice in general. Is the standard of care in Europe or in the UK or whatever European country you're working in, is it similar than it is in the US? If it is, then that bodes well to bringing data into the US and submitting it to the FDA. Also, if you're working at sites outside of the US, you're going to need to be able to certify that data is collected under a GCP type of environment, a good clinical practice type of environment. And if folks want, I'm certainly doing a bit of a promotional here for Proxima. We just published a knowledge base on our website that really explains what good clinical practice procedures are. If folks want to, ask more questions and see that, then go to our website and see. But you have to do the study and conduct the study under GCP type of environments. And then probably the third thing I would add to that is if you're collecting qualitative endpoints like pain management or something like that, does it translate from one country to another? I don't know if, here in the US we're a bunch of whiny bags, so maybe we can't tolerate pain as well as they can in other countries. That's a bad example, but that type of endpoint analysis needs to be done, as well as making sure that there's no population differences or genetic differences between the countries that you're working in. So if all of those things line up, then usually you can bring that data, in from, say, an EU country and to support your FDA packet.
Thanks. And by the way, Frank, you're welcome to chime in on any of these things as we go. So when you mentioned a lot before, Frank, about how to choose KOLs and look at their publishing record and all those other things. Are there any other considerations that would be specific, from your perspective, if you're not here in the U.S. and you're in the Europe and you're trying to figure out who to work with in the U.S., any other considerations to think about, or be covered at all?
No, I mean, there are all sorts of formal networks out there, and then there's the informal. But you can start with the formal ones because they, friends have friends who do what they do. We started a network called GREAT, which means Gruppo Research of Acute Conditions in Italian, but it spells great. And we have 103 countries involved in that. So we can go anywhere around the world, and now that one's all in acute care conditions, but it's the same type of thing. If you can find these networks that, if you want to study sickle cell disease or something of that nature, you find networks of physicians who are in that, and they can bring their friends on who bring their friends on and so forth. I think that's the best. I wanted to add one thing to Kevin's about bringing the Europe data over. Even if you can't bring it over completely, you can bring some of it. So when we do troponin research in chest pain patients, Europe has a much different management, so it doesn't work really well in that they see a lot more MIs acutely in their ERs than we do. We see about 5% of chest pain, they see about 30%. So the FDA has rightly said, no, we can't bring that over. It's different. But they allow us to take a third of that data and bring that over. So we still have to do trials in the United States that are almost exactly the same as the European ones, but we can combine the data sets so that we don't have to do 1,500 patients. We just do 1,000 here. So there is ways to work around that when the case management doesn't exactly line up between the U.S. and whatever country you've gotten your data originated on.
Thanks a lot, Frank. General question for the panel, which is related to something maybe that Frank brought up earlier, and that is related to some post-market work So, real world evidence, things like that. What are some innovative strategies that people should be considering, that our startups and anyone else who's tuning in and watching this video should be considering for post-market data collection, et cetera? So Frank, I'll start with you on that, and then the others can join in.
Okay. So what I always do is I have the KOLs that I'm going to have on my study, and I make them sit in a room, and now we do this by Zoom, and each one of them will say what they're going to publish after the primary manuscript. So once you've taken your FDA pivotal trial and you cleared, now what do they do? And each one of them has to pick something and then publish on it. And by that way, you're guaranteed at least 10 publications post-marketing, post-approval. The other piece is database gathering once you've gotten FDA clearance, and that's the registry. That is the cheapest, most efficient way to gather data. Randomized controlled trials are expensive. They just are. And there's no way around that. But post-marketing surveillance data is outstanding, and it's 1/10 of the cost if you planned it and got it done. So everybody who gets your drug or everybody who gets use of your device, you record their name and see what happens and follow them. And that's very easy to do in the electronic era. As long as it's minimally risk for the patient, most IRBs have no trouble with that. And in fact, the FDA demands it sometimes if you have a high-risk drug. So that's an outstanding way to efficiently do that. And the same thing holds true with your randomized trial, is that you get your KOLs who are doing your post-marketing surveillance data and figure out what they're going to publish before you start gathering data, so that if they want to know, the costs or the effects of alternative medications, people take St. John's wort or whatever on your drug, that data is gathered and then you can do it. But if you don't remember to ask it, you won't get it. And who's going to know to ask that unless the KOL told you, oh, put that on your case report form so we gather it. So it's really important to get your KOLs together early so they can do something. If you give them a bunch of data and say, here, it's like, well, we'll try to get a paper out of it. But if you ask them what they want and you get it for them and you hand it to them, you're going to get a paper. And publications are, I used to call the rubber chicken dinners. They would have these dinners and they'd have the company would come in and talk about their new thing. Those are gone. We're not going to do those anymore. And that's not just COVID. It's because they're, the Sunshine Act and all those sort of things. The physicians don't want to be labeled on that. So there'll be no more rubber chicken dinners. That's not a big loss, by the way. But you still have to figure out how to get post-clearance marketing, and that is publications. That is your lifeblood. Great.
Thank you for that as well. So in last 4 or 5 minutes or so of the live portion of the broadcast, I want to remind our companies, so start queuing up your questions in Q&A if you have specific questions. I have a whole host of questions that were sent to me in advance that we're not going to get into in the main broadcast, so I'll make sure we get to those. But startups, again, put your questions into the Q&A and put your name with them so that we can call on you to come up and ask them live. So a couple last things. One topic that is something that I think a lot of people are talking about is health equity, and we talk a lot about the lack of diversity in clinical studies. And one of the general questions that I always have is something related to what Frank was saying earlier about don't just go to these big centers just because they got big names and they're going to sound really good on the cred side to have at least one, but you want to diversify just your base of studies to lots of different centers. But I'm sure there are things that are different, nuances that are different from working with the community hospital and different types of hospitals in general. So maybe in this last minute or two, we can talk briefly about that. What are some things that people should consider in terms of trying to diversify their clinical study populations? And what are some of the challenges, or what are the strategies maybe that you employ in terms of bringing on other sites? What are some of the challenges of working with a community hospital, for example? So again, I'm going to open this up for the panel. Whoever wants to start, maybe Matt, you haven't had a chance to talk. You want to talk for a little while?
Sure. I'll add a few thoughts, and then definitely love Kevin and Frank's thoughts on this one too. So I think first of all, I mean, the first thought is making sure you've got a representation for your study of the population of interest. And so sometimes that's taken very literally just the indication, but also you got to think like if you're the FDA, you want this across the US. So you do want to traditionally have a geographical mix and then a gender mix, ethnic mix of your population. So one way to think about that is really thinking about your sites and where they're located. What's the makeup and demographic of that population. So it requires you to dig a little bit deeper in thought when you are selecting your sites, I think, and ask them those questions of what their patient population actually looks like and represents. That's very easily done. It's just a question that you got to ask up front. And then you asked around kind of the clinical, whether you're a community-based hospital, or traditional, maybe academic type hospital. We often think of that mix in terms of enrollment too, as Frank said. Sometimes those guys are, we want to mix executionally, operationally for the study. And so it's kind of natural for us to think of that one up front anyway, even though we're not necessarily thinking about diversity, but that kind of also has the extra benefit of diversity. I think for the most case, then you just have to think about logistics when you're dealing with those sites. We worked with a lot of community-based centers over the years. It was really just, there's no different types of questions you're going to ask. You're going to ask them and really trying to understand the PI and the patient population. Are they committed to enrolling on your study? And then you ask a few of those logistics, how they handle contracts and IRBs. But for the most part, they're actually easier to work with, I find, than your larger academic centers. You're going to get them up and running typically faster.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. And then Frank, anything else you want to add on that topic?
Yeah, so the FDA is going to require that you have 15% African American, 15% Latino, maybe 10% Asian. They're sometimes soft on that, and 50% female. And if you don't, they're not going to approve you, period. That's not hard. If you want African Americans, you go to Detroit or Chicago and do urban downtown centers. You want Latino, you can come to Houston, the southwestern U.S. You want Asians, you can be in San Francisco. Pretty much everybody knows these population areas, and you just make sure you have enough centers there. It's not a hard thing to do, but you have to do it because you need to reflect the United States with your product when you're done.
Great.
And I'll just say one thing. I know we're closing out, Paul, but having some experience working at a site, and also sometimes struggling to collect data from certain ethnic and racial areas. I started out by talking about trust and being able to interview trust. Well, when we put together an RFP, the first thing that we have in that response to the proposal from the company is usually our site qualification. And the companies usually go, well, that's, I can do site qualification. Well, it really, actually, these are things that we go through and try to understand ourselves as a CRO, because we've done it before, about what's your enrollment strategies for these particular population areas. We're not just checking to make sure that there are shock paddles close to the, surgery table or something like that. A lot of folks think it's just check off the box stuff, but there's really an evaluation that goes into that process, and also understanding, to what level of trust does the site have within these particular communities. I worked in Denver at an oncology center, and where I was working at locally, we actually struggled with getting some of the other groups like, Latinos and Hispanics to actually enroll on clinical trials, because there was a lot of distrust between the staff, just us being, lily white folks that worked at the particular clinical center, and so they didn't necessarily just trust us to enroll them on a clinical trial, but when we had folks that could communicate with them and explain things and answer their questions and really go through that true informed consent process, then we were able to enroll much better. And so understanding, if you've got all of those things in place at your site, that's really important to, go through that level of diligence with your CRO and with your sites that are enrolling to understand if they've got that ability to enroll in that trust factor.
Very helpful. Thank you, Kevin. All right. So as you mentioned, Kevin, we're already past time. So we got to wrap up. As I mentioned, there are a lot of questions which we will get to now in this last portion, which will not be on the live broadcast, but for all of our other companies, you'll have a chance to hang on here. So I'm going to wrap up our live stream. Any closing remarks, Frank? I'll start with you that you want to make and tell people how to find you if they want to reach out to you.
Sure. I'm Frank Peacock at gmail.com, all one word. It's real simple. More than happy to answer questions or continue conversation. I've enjoyed this. Thank you for having me and getting to hang out with you guys.
Thank you. Next, Matt.
Yep, as Kevin, I think, put in our chat, but I don't know if everyone can see that for sure on YouTube, but it's just matt@proximacro.com. And that's how you can get most of our guys at the company, and just first name at proximacro.com. So feel free to follow up with questions. Just little closing remarks, I guess, of what I would say to a company starting to plan clinicals is plan early. I know that's a common thing, but plan early and then engage early. I think Frank's mentioned this with KOLs. I would also just add that to other types of advisors. So whether it's CROs or whether you're considering any type of specialist out there, get advice from multiple areas. Don't let that bias that your product is the best thing since sliced bread, get in the way. Get a little bit of advice from multiple places and then get planning early. That planning will help you save time in the long run. So it'll give you good insight on how long your study is going to take, which again, how much that's going to cost ultimately too. So definitely do some planning and engage early. Early
is always my advice. That's terrific. Thank you for that, Matt. And then Kevin, you get the final word.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Appreciate the opportunity to have this video cast. And again, we work at proximacro.com. Folks can access our website there, and we've got a knowledge base where a lot of these commonly asked questions that we get every single day, we post the answers to. There's probably a lot of things that you guys have questions about you didn't get a chance to ask. Go check out the website and see if you can find answers there. My email address is kevin@proximacro.com. And, I think as I think about closing words, when you're developing a product and you're running a small company, a startup company, which a lot of you are, you're living by that mantra of not letting perfection, be the enemy of progress, or however it's quoted. But once you get to clinical development and doing a clinical trial, you need to be perfect. And so whether you work with us or whether you work with another group, another consultant or whatever, I really encourage folks, to work with a partner, to work with someone that's done it before. If you want to go far, you go with someone else, right? So just whoever you work with, make sure that you feel good about working with them. You trust what they're doing. Meet their employees. Meet the folks that are going to actually execute on their studies. And thanks again, Paul.
Thank you, Kevin. Great working with you guys. And Frank, it's terrific to bring you into the fold here too in the MedTech Innovator ecosystem. Really great insight from all of you today. For anyone who wants to learn more about MedTech Innovator, these companies who are part of our program, as well as our partners, you can do that at medtechinnovator.org. And if you want to find out more about these other videos, the ones that have been passed already that cover topics like funding, for example, you can find those at medtechinnovator.org/live, medtechinnovator.org/live, as well as the upcoming schedule for what's going to be coming up over the next several months in terms of our webinars and other opportunities. There'll be an opportunity to meet all of our companies as part of a showcase coming up. So lots of things to tune into. So please do that, and you'll get a chance to learn more about us and all the great companies that are part of the program. So terrific broadcast today. Thanks, everyone. All of our panelists, please stand by, don't leave, and our startups as well. And we'll continue with the Q&A. And for everyone else, have a great day.